paper reports that two of the male prostitutes were given a late-night tour of the White House last year.
Entitled. You want answers.
I want the truth.
You can't handle the truth.
Everybody, my name is Nick Bryant, and welcome to the Nick Bryant Podcast. My guest today is Valerie Sinason, a UK-based therapist and psychoanalyst who's worked extensively with children and adults suffering from extreme trauma. She's also a prolific author. How are you doing today, Valerie?
As well as I can do in a country that's rather depressed at the moment. The UK is full of worries about fuel, about growing inequality, more disturbance, more young people let down. Another day in a country that's so lucky and yet has fallen in this moment.
Well, I think the pandemic has taken a toll on most countries, especially on the middle class.
Yep.
And a deluge of allegations regarding politicians and sundry brokers molesting children, and also the cover-up of those crimes, has confronted the citizens of the United Kingdom. The vast majority of the allegations streaming out of the UK, piercing the US media, implicate BBC superstar Jimmy Savile as a serial pedophile. But the bulk of the story has yet to navigate the Atlantic. The allegations have touched the zenith of the UK power structure, implicating former Prime Minister Ted Heath as a pederast. The accounts emerging in the British media are that of UK power brokers molesting children for decades, cover-ups emanating from the pinnacle of the British government, blackmail, and even murder. Would you like to give us some opening comments on that, Valerie?
Well, it was the famous American psychohistorian Lloyd DeMose who said the history of childhood is a nightmare from which we're only beginning to wake up. I think the problem in the UK and elsewhere, we're only now realizing the extent of abuse of our population. So when I started work in the 70s, it was thought there were only 200 or so abused children in the whole of the UK. Now the government accepts it's 11 million people are likely to be abused in their lifetime, who, if they joined together, would be the biggest political party that ever existed. But because of pain and trauma, it's so hard for them to link up. But we haven't really caught up with the implications of this, that abuse comes from every social class, every religion, every culture, and more dangerously, when it's abuse by the powerful, they have far more resources with which to silence and shame their victims.
Those numbers are staggering, but the Center for Disease Control has also stated that 25% of American women have been abused as minors. So there's millions, and it says the Centers of Disease Control has said 6% of boys have been molested as minors, but that figure is probably much higher. But the composite of that translates to millions and millions of people living in the United States who were molested as minors.
Absolutely. And if in a few years' time we start hearing about the brutality of children assaulted by their teachers, I know one very painful thing to those of us that really care about America is the amount of allowed physical abuse of young people in schools and colleges by their teachers. Once this becomes outlawed, you start hearing about all the sadists who take advantage of this. So it's going to end up being more than 1 in 4. But it was in 2015, I attended a meeting at the House of Commons called the White Flowers Campaign. It was named in honor of the children all abused by the Belgian high-up political abuse ring. And it was to do with the amount of people talking of abuse within the Houses of Parliament. And in the interval, I found several people shaken and crying who approached me and wanted me to know that they'd been abused by MPs and they never ever thought they would dare to walk into the House of Commons. This was the most brave thing they'd done. And they'd also not dared to vote as adults because they felt their vote was meaningless because they'd been silenced by high-level people who they said had abused them. It was a very powerful sight to see.
And MPs are members of parliament, which are analogous to congressmen and senators in the United States.
That's right.
There was this rash of cover-ups in the 1980s, very reminiscent of the Franklin scandal in the 80s, but also the Epstein scandal that's wended through the first couple of decades of this century. And now the earliest intimations of a cover-up date back to the late 70s and involved British aristocrat Sir Peter Heyman. He held a variety of senior posts in the British diplomatic corps, and The Guardian reported that he was a longtime deputy director of MI6, which is the UK's version of the CIA. He also was the recipient of several exalted titles. But Sir Peter, however, had a title that wasn't shared public. It was member 330 of the Pedophile Information Exchange, or PI, an elite fraternal order society dedicated to the sexual abuse of children. One UK article reported that PI had a 200-year-old legacy, but a second article reported that it wasn't such a time-honored tradition. Are you familiar with Sir Peter and the Pedophile Information Exchange?
Yes, and it took a long while for the papers to really say anything significant there. We could do with you in the UK, Nick, and the many thanks to you for what you've done over the Franklin scandal. What's been really shocking here has been the length of time it takes for something to be followed through when it's well-known people. And even when it is finally followed through, with Jimmy Savile only after he died, there's lots more that then gets buried with the person because it's somewhere not bearable. There seems to be a curious thing that happens to everybody, professionals in the mental health field as well, that if somebody tells you, I was abused by Mr. or Mrs. Brown in Brown Street, and you don't know them, you haven't heard of them, you give your full attention and listening, and ditto as a police officer. If somebody says, I've been abused by the Prime Minister or royalty, this evokes terror. People suddenly are taken out of their comfortable professional space, which is, if you like, separate from the rest of the world. You're dealing with a mental health issue, or you're looking, is there adequate evidence for a crime? If you're a police officer, suddenly you're in a state of terror that you're going to get it wrong, that you'll be in trouble, that it's not safe to follow this through. And one of the things that, if you like, is one of the strangest and most worrying things that's happened as a result of this in the UK is what happened to a man called Carl Beach, who was nicknamed Nick by the media, who gave a disclosure that he'd been abused by Ted Heath, Jimmy Savile, and other leading figures. Now, there was something about him that made the police officers that listened to him really feel he was giving good evidence, and actually publicly stating someone had made a disclosure about Ted Heath. This led to a huge flurry of press interest, people attacking Ted Heath, people praising Ted Heath, all a bit worrying in that it was without a trial, it was without evidence being looked at carefully. However, it turns out that Nick was proven to be lying, that he couldn't have been in the places where he said he was, and that his evidence didn't add up. So most survivors that I knew all felt, looking at him and listening to him, that he'd gone through something traumatic, that whatever disinformation or messy narrative, or even if he'd pinched someone else's story because it fitted him emotionally, there was somebody clearly disturbed here. What happened? He was called a fantasist, but he was given a prison sentence longer than a murderer. All the powerful people that had been named and others came forward to say, disgusting, he's trashed my reputation. There was no thought given to, well, the fact that his story might not be correct doesn't mean that other people's were necessarily wrong that named the same people. But there was a powerful silence in all the press the moment he was sentenced. And I have had so many survivors ring up to say, how can I speak about the famous people that abused me if you're then stitched up and given a prison sentence longer than a murderer? And the public prosecution system has acknowledged that since Nick was imprisoned for 18 years for lying, 18 years for lying, that people aren't coming forward. And that has been extremely worrying as to what has happened. Obviously, if you're wrongly accused, that is being abused, and it's horrible. And if you are a famous person wrongly accused, you have all the pain and shame of being wrongly in the public eye. But survivors are wrongly accused every day. They're discredited in court and in the press, and no one is caring about the thousands of survivors each day who are discredited. Whereas if you are well known, you have instantly somehow everything on your side. So that's a worrying side to me of establishment wanting to shut up people who are naming famous people.
In the Franklin scandal, there was a young woman named Alicia Owen who was abused and said that she was abused and refused to recant her accounts of abuse. And in the Franklin scandal, I very much demonstrate that she had been abused by the network that I wrote about. And she was sentenced between 9 and 15 years for perjury and put in solitary for 2 years. And she was telling the truth. But her sentence was a very loud message to all the victims that had been molested in that particular network was, if you step up and you tell the truth, this is what's going to happen to you.
Absolutely, that is terrifying. And the equivalent in England that happens, which I have seen a lot of, is a mother, more usually, listens to her children talking about ritual abuse by father or father and others or somebody well known, and goes to social services to get help for her children. She is then seen as mad. Her children are taken away from her and often given to the alleged abuser. The secrecy of family courts in the UK, whilst ostensibly it's to protect the confidentiality of children, leads to abuses like that happening.
There have been tremendous abuses in the family courts in the United States of America also. And there's a fountainhead of growing people that are very concerned about what's been going on in family courts. I've been contacted by two women who both have doctorates, who both taught at very esteemed universities, and they wanted me to investigate their case. Their husbands were proven child molesters, and the courts had awarded their children to their husbands. And they fought and fought and fought, but to no avail. There was nothing that they could do. And I believe, lost their jobs at these major universities because they were so vocal about what had happened to them. And it's very rare. I mean, there are people like who you referenced earlier who did lie about being abused, but there was a judge, a federal district court judge. His name was Patrick Schills. He had been an attorney for the various Catholic dioceses in 500 molestation cases that he worked for or worked on. And after he became a judge, he was interviewed by the New York Times. And keep in mind that he worked on 500 cases, and he said that he felt less than 10 of those individuals were lying. So he felt that basically 98% of the victims that came forward were in fact victims.
Well, that actually is the percentage that I've found as well, that in one survey of the first 100 children and 100 adults with an intellectual disability who were alleging abuse, only 2% were found to have got something wrong. Not that they'd been abused, but naming the wrong person. And it was quite unconscious that it was so terrifying to name who it was. All the feeling got displaced onto someone else. And if you're that innocent person it's displaced on, even though it's only 2 in 100, obviously that is awful. But 98 out of the 100 are not being listened to properly. And we do know that once Jimmy Savile died and people were talking about all his connections, and a previous MP, Sir Cyril Smith, who beat boys and sexually abused them, one police officer told me, I remember when we'd taken him in and we thought we've really got him now, he made a few phone calls higher up, and half an hour later we saw him leaving the police station, walking down the road jauntily with not a care in the world. This is what we know, so that people that everybody knew there was something suspicious about them, when it was found out, they could still get off because government was thought more important than dispensable disturbed children. And I think this is one of the real difficulties with inequality as well, that where you have a rich, powerful, largely man, but sometimes women as well, against a child or teenager that's disturbed, with a mental health history because of what's been done to them, a prison history because of what's been done to them, their pathway is held against them. And that's one of the awful things we find in forensic therapy, which is trauma at the root of disturbed behavior.
Earlier, I talked about Sir Peter Heyman, and according to The Guardian, he was the number 3 man in MI6, which is the UK's equivalent to the CIA. And he ran an organization called PI, and actually Scotland Yard was tipped off to his organization, which was run out of a house under a pseudonym. And the house was raided, and according to other sources, Ted Heath was part of PI, along with Sir Peter Heyman. And nothing happened to any of those politicians and power brokers that were part of PI. There were no charges whatsoever. And again, that's to that point where if people have money and power, that they can oftentimes molest children with impunity.
Well, absolutely. The police force that had the uncomfortable job of investigating Ted Heath was so attacked by the media. Any error that they made was leapt on. And how on earth are honourable police officers expected to be when they're attacked for doing their job?
With the Franklin scandal, it had connections to intelligence, and there was definitely blackmail. And also Epstein had connections to intelligence, and there was definitely blackmail. So you have Sir Peter Heyman and Ted Heath belonging to the same organization that basically exists to molest children. How could blackmail not be deployed there? How could Ted Heath not be blackmailed? By MI6, by the CIA, and probably by the KGB. I mean, I don't see how Ted Heath could not have risen to that rank and not been blackmail fodder.
It's so damaging for democracy and everything when there are so many unanswered questions about people in high places, because it does destroy your faith. And at the moment, with all the disinformation and lying from political leaders, it adds to the feeling of uncertainty in this world. You want moral integrity from your leaders. And it also is bad when there is confusion left, because when I read that unknown Mr. Brown is alleged to have abused his daughter, who I work with, I don't go around thinking about Mr. Brown. I'm just thinking about my patient. But when someone is naming Ted Heath, you carry these people around in your head because they're part of the outside world you live in. So if you are carrying on thinking about them and they're innocent, or they haven't done most of the things that's said, you're part of something really uncomfortable, which is why police really need to be given the freedom to investigate. But people that are coming forward naming political leaders need far more courage and are petrified with all the threats they've been told about what will happen to them. When I was first told about Jimmy Savile by somebody, that was before the internet, where someone couldn't have got their story from a whole group of other people. And I can remember the embarrassment with which I raised it with an officer, because of thinking, surely this sort of person that did all these popular shows, surely this can't be true, but I've got to report it. That's what my task is for safeguarding if somebody names somebody. But I still, with embarrassment, remember my young self feeling, oh dear, this could lead to trouble. And this was, way before he became public. So poor survivors, knowing someone is going to be really worried hearing a name that they know about.
In the United States, the former Speaker of the House, which is the third most powerful man constitutionally in the United States, was Dennis Hastert. And he had been a predator on minors, boys, for dating back at least 30 years. And then he won a congressional seat for Illinois, and then he was bumped up to Speaker of the House. He just had this meteoric rise, even though he'd been a child predator for decades. And the FBI was, when he was Speaker of the House, the FBI had a recording of someone talking about Hastert going to a townhouse near Chicago and engaging in quote unquote immoral activity. So the FBI was even aware that the third most powerful man in the country constitutionally was a pedophile, and nothing happened to him. Actually, being a child molester seemed to help his career. And I've seen other instances of that. I've been investigating this sewer for 21 years, and I've seen instances where people have been accused, and actually the evidence can be overwhelming, that they were child molesters, but yet they've continued to their rise. And one ended up in Bill Clinton's cabinet, as far as I know. So,
Whoa.
although people don't want to hear about this, it is very much a reality.
I think we're seeing deep down, despite all the improvement in children's rights, how hated children are. That actually people are prepared, and not just sadists, but your ordinary jobbing person is prepared to sacrifice a disturbed, traumatized child to keep their political party running smoothly. That it's a sacrifice, quite deliberate.
Well, the United States pays a lot of lip service to children being its most precious natural resource. But the statistics with children are kind of mind-boggling. Children are the fastest growing segment of the homeless population. There are at least 2 million children in the United States that don't have health care insurance. So when a child is deprived of health care insurance and also homeless, it can just have devastating developmental consequences. There was a researcher named Greg Duncan at the University of Michigan, and he found that if a child was born at a low birth weight and subjected to 5 years of continuous poverty, their IQ was going to be 90. So they're pretty much, after 5 years of life, they're pretty much taken out of society for the most part. And if the child was Black, their IQ is going to be 85. So these children that are born in lower socioeconomic circumstances and subjected to continuous poverty, they are not going to be able to become, chances are they are not going to be able to become productive members of society.
And it's the same in the UK. And if we look at the extreme end, that whilst any social class, you can have a chromosomal abnormality or disability, but the majority of people with an intellectual disability it's only mild, and they're the lowest social class. And it's because there's been no stimulation, there's been racism, there's been stigma, there's been violence to the mother before the child's birth. So you're cutting off that child's chance to think and be for a large number of children. And of course, any attack on parents that's not supporting poor parents and wants to punish the parents for not being successful, you're actually hurting the children. And every war is a war on children, because it's the children are going to be traumatized and be the next generation with PTSD. So you're right, we care more for children than previous generations, but we're a very primitive species. And we find it so hard to bring up children without physically assaulting them in the classroom.
Getting back to Sir Peter Heyman, Margaret Thatcher, the prime minister in the 80s, was actually given a dossier about Sir Peter Heyman. And it enumerated his crimes and his crimes against children. And Margaret Thatcher covered it up. And what's troubled me throughout these years is when I see women complicit in the abuse of children, which Margaret Thatcher was by covering up Sir Peter Heyman's predations, it's really disheartening to me.
That Margaret Thatcher's father was known to be a ladies' man that flirted with the teenagers that worked for him, And so there'd be some way she was identified with that, which is pretty painful. But you don't have a whole fights going on to protect children over their current poverty levels or depleted education, that somehow it has to be and has been a women's movement first. Only when there were attempts to protect women from domestic violence was there an attempt to support children. Coming after that, children did not come first and still don't.
Unfortunately, I have not seen the Me Too movement or anyone in the Me Too movement talk about the Epstein victims. And the Epstein victims actually think that they're being ignored by the Me Too movement, and it looks that way, unfortunately.
Gosh.
It's a very sad state of affairs here. There was a woman, MP named Barbara Ann Castle.
Oh, yes.
She tried to bring these allegations to the public. And she had served in Parliament from 1945 to 1979. And she brought these up in the House of Commons. And she managed to acquire documentation of the Home Office's investigation of Sir Peter and Pye. And she gave it to a local newspaper. And they were going the allegations and the evidence that the Home Office had acquired, which the Home Office is kind of like the FBI. And the newspaper that she gave it to was suddenly raided at gunpoint by what in the United States would be a SWAT team. And they confiscated all of that evidence and threatened the editor of that paper. I mean, that's how far the British society was willing to go to make sure that those allegations didn't get out.
I think we're seeing, regardless of the individuals involved, a really big public fear at facing the reality of how children are treated. That somehow, because each generation is trying to do one bit better, it's only really since the awfulness of the Second World War, there was even the beginning of a sense of a childhood that could be freer in lucky Western countries. But to actually realize people in positions of power, the priests, the nuns, the teachers, could be hurting children, the MPs, the superstars, is somewhere not bearable. And you know the powerful Greek myth of Cassandra, who was condemned to always prophesy the truth but not be believed until after it happened. Well, I found to my shock when I looked up the myth in more detail that she was given that curse because she resisted the advances of the god Apollo. So we actually have a Greek myth that is telling us that if you fight back and don't accept, you will be discredited. And I don't see a country anywhere that can actually bear to realize the extent of rottenness and corruption. It's not bearable. Or you have a few days of public lament. How can we be like this? And then it's all closed up again. Or the survivor that was praised, like Regine Delouf in Belgium, is suddenly discredited after being seen as a brave heroine. So it is an international human problem to face a painful reality of what a primitive species we are.
In the case that I was mentioning, when the UK police raided that newspaper, that information was impounded under national security. it was given a D notice, which is equivalent to national security in the United States of America. And this is what I found to be really interesting, is that there was a whistleblower in the Home Office. And he said that a special branch had actually infiltrated the pedophile information exchange to covertly identify and potentially blackmail the power brokers who were affiliated with the organization. So the special branch actually was aware of PI, or the Pedophile Information Exchange, and they infiltrated it to blackmail the politicians, which is another instance of blackmail, which I've come across so many times.
Well, absolutely. And again, a further example that it's all right to sacrifice children. Let's get rid of them for the sake of political power we can have over significant adults. And if we think of some of the congressional papers that were found over MK Ultra, Operation Paperclip, the situations where pedophiles were blackmailed to hand over their own abused children in return for not being prosecuted, so that those children experiments could be done on those children to make them more dissociative, to see what use they could be for experiments. And this was done to children. So they weren't rescued from their paedophile homes. They were sold into the hands of governments.
Yes, that was in an episode previously. I talked to Dr. Conway, and he was talking about that specific problem. And what's really interesting is that when Scotland Yard seized all that information from Sir Peter Heyman and Pi, and then it was ultimately given to Barbara Ann Castle, and then she gave it to that newspaper. It included correspondence among Pi members discussing their pedophilic fantasies, which included the torture and murder of children. An alleged victim who came forward in 2014 told Scotland Yard that he had been abused by a VIP pedophile network between the ages of 7 and 16, and the pedophiles had abused him had murdered 3 underage victims. Now, I know that that sounds very extreme to people that haven't followed just how sadistic pedophiles can be. But there is a subgenus of pedophiles who are pure psychopaths, and they actually experience pleasure from being sadistic to children. And I'm sure that you've encountered that.
Absolutely. The group that are like that can be found exploiting all these situations. And once a group with milder leanings get caught up with such people, you've got the damage and danger that comes from a consensus, a whole group being corrupted further, which is really frightening.
A second alleged victim from Scotland Yard's investigation into the 80s came forward, and he too said that he attended these power broker pedophile orgies as a child. And he named a Tory cabinet minister who he said had murdered a 15-year-old girl. And at the time, the police were taking these allegations very, very seriously. So we have this problem. And then the UK was going to have a commission that was going to look at all of these allegations and actually hopefully give them redress and seek justice for the victims. But that whole effort got hijacked. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, it's a very mixed message, because the independent inquiry did mean that there were people, and its linked Truth Project allowed people to speak and be heard in the most respectful way, offering them support afterwards. but it wasn't given the level of support or investigatory powers that people had hoped for. But it did provide a respectful hearing.
But ultimately, there wasn't really anybody who were any perpetrators that were charged with crimes coming out of that commission, as I understand. I could be wrong.
No, it was largely listening to, which is what's been so painful, is the fact that the kind of evidence police want is not the kind of evidence that a traumatized person largely has. Police are asking for time, date, place, description, clothes, when someone traumatized can say that person hurt me and everything else is a blur, where the police have not been given the right to have a clinical meeting, to hear the person, make a relationship with them. They're made to take statements immediately when someone might not be ready for a statement, might not be in the right state of mind yet, or if someone is dissociative and there is no awareness of this in the police, one state can give one piece of evidence, another state can completely disagree with it. For example, I don't know whether it fits what you were saying earlier, where someone was talking about witnessing a huge number of murders. And of course, given all the, if you like, people who are anonymous, babies that no one knows about, anything is possible. But with dissociative identity disorder, I have seen the way in which the murder of one baby can sound like the murder of 40 babies, because each state saw a different moment and no one is lying, but then they're not listened to because it sounds extreme. And the other example I had, which I have permission to say, was a woman with Down syndrome who kept telling me Margaret Thatcher had abused her. And she could tell me in the most surprisingly detailed way everything Margaret Thatcher wore. And this never changed. And it was after about a year in therapy, she was suddenly able to talk about a program she watched called Spitting Image, a satirical program where there were puppets representing Margaret Thatcher and other leading people. And she was abused in front of this television. So she was looking at Margaret Thatcher's face on the screen while she was being abused. And when you've got people who are telling the truth, but it could get taken so wrongly, and for some people it takes so much time to be able to speak, and police forces aren't prepared to do that. Because there was this woman talking about a huge ring infiltrating her learning disability place. And that just went on with her lovely family and other parents trying hopelessly to deal with this, because abuse in institutions for people with an intellectual disability is huge. In fact, my first novel that I've written, that will be out in November, I've focused on this subject, which is a young woman who with a disability who says the Prime Minister has raped her, because I wanted to explore what happens to an ordinary psychiatrist, social worker, therapist, when they're hearing something like that. What do the police do? And looking at the layers above and above and above who stay way out of it, they're never picked up. The people that blackmail the Prime Minister, they don't get picked up because the Prime Minister doesn't get picked up. It's all the small people. They're the easiest to pick up.
A number of therapists have approached me and thanked me for writing the Franklin scandal, where I show that there is such a thing as a power broker pedophile network that ascends to the apogee of society. And because they have had clients talk about these type of networks, but these type of networks are never acknowledged, especially when you start getting to the pinnacle of power. And we have, again, in this country, we have Jeffrey Epstein. And I had thought, after I had written the Franklin scandal, that if another Franklin scandal had happened in the United States with the internet, that it would be impossible to cover up. But the Jeffrey Epstein case has been covered up. None of those perpetrators have been put in prison. And it's been done in broad daylight in the United States of America. And I find that extremely disheartening, that all those perpetrators, and we know who a number of those perpetrators are in the Epstein case, and they do go all the way up to Mount Olympus. They've all walked, and people seem to be all right with it. I've tried to, initially I went to anti-trafficking organizations, and they seemed somewhat enthusiastic, but I was told by one trafficking organization that I was trying to conscript to help me protest this, that Jeffrey Epstein was just too nebulous and vague. And that's why they didn't want to participate. And I wrote her an email back and I said, nebulous and vague. I mean, we know exactly where he lived. We know exactly, we know a number of the victims because a number of them have filed lawsuits, and they've named a number of the perpetrators. I mean, how could that be vague and nebulous? And I never got a return email. When I write emails like that, I generally don't get return emails.
No, but I can say there are many people that have expressed gratitude for what you write, and certainly those of us that have worked in this field do. And we are important colleagues of each other, in that unless someone has specifically said, please can you find a way for this to be made public, they have to rely on confidentiality and not being betrayed when they've been betrayed so much. And so whilst I can build up pictures after all these years of groups, as you say, it's why in a way a novel is a way I can explore it, because whilst some people I've worked with have written very brave and moving pieces, my job is to try and help someone with their life in whatever way I can. And if they end up going to the police, that's one very courageous, risky way. And if they don't, that brings its own trouble too. But as a citizen that's worked in the field of abuse, then in my role as a public citizen, I am on the alert, noticing in the press things like what happened to Nick, things like, yes, that there is a Roman Catholic human rights barrister, Wilfred Wong, who's worked in the field of ritual abuse, helping survivors for years, really publicly. He's not a therapist. He is looking for legal attempts to help, and he was feeling the police weren't doing anything. And 40 years later, I suddenly see big headings, Wilfred Wong arrested for chilling abduction. And just like Nick the Fantasist, suddenly there is, with a gang, he chillingly abducted a child, holding the foster parents at knife point. Then it disappears. Then you hear that actually he's a misguided Satan hunter. He thought the child was being abused and went with several adults to rescue the child. Now he has been given a sentence longer than a murderer, and nothing else is said because of the silence in the children's court. So we don't know who were the people that went with him, what the real story is. And it's these silent things from quiet people that are as significant in plain sight as the Jimmy Saviles.
There's that quote, evil flourishes when good men and women do nothing. And
yes.
So how can we break the silence, Valerie? What would be your initial steps on how we can break the silence?
I think the first thing is accepting we are unwelcome Cassandras, that we are changing whatever fantasy people are needing to have about the state of children's lives. We're spoiling it. So we wouldn't be welcome even with the facts staring in people's faces. So the people that said there's no child abuse will now say, oh, it's 1 in 4, but they'll dissociate from that. So we have to have thick skins and we have to carry on. As we have people in this field aren't doing a 9 to 5, they are realizing there's a social ethical imperative. There is a moral imperative. This is the corruption that is destroying countries on the inside. When you steal from the lives of children, you're stealing the country's future. So we are not popular. The other is if we accept that and we can say, we know this isn't bearable, but to quote Shakespeare, madness in great ones cannot unwatched go. The more powerful the person being accused, the more important it is that the public can see law is properly followed. Because if corruption is allowed to go unanswered at the top, there is no hope.
Well, I want to thank you for coming on the Nick Bryant podcast today.
Well, I'm very proud to be on it and very grateful for your work, Nick.
And I'm also very grateful for your work, Valerie. And have yourself a wonderful night.
Thank you. And you.